Good afternoon, and thank you all for the call to discuss the draft of the tariff language, agreements, and definitions in Appendix A as part of the EIM Sub-Entity Scheduling Coordinator Initiative. These documents were posted on April 15th on the initiative webpage. We did ask stakeholders to submit written comments on the documents. We did receive comments from 6 cities, Platte River Power Authority, and PacifiCorp, which we will address during this call. My name is Christina Osborne from ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I will be the meeting facilitator. Ethan is the event producer from AT&T. John Anders from ISO Legal will actually be presenting today. We do have several other ISO subject matter experts who are on the line who have been involved in this initiative, and they are here to respond to questions. That includes Danny Johnson, Deb Levine, Heidi Carter, James Lynn. And then we have some others on the participant line. So just a couple of reminders before we get started. We are recording the call today. We do make the recording available out on the initiative webpage for a limited time. We just ask that any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. We usually receive the video file from AT&T within 3 to 5 business days after the meeting, so once we receive it, we will post it. If you have a question at any time during the call, you can press #2 to raise your hand. We just ask that you state your name and affiliation first, and I will remind you how to raise your hand as we go through the presentation. These calls are structured to stimulate an honest dialogue and engage different perspectives, and we just ask that you please keep your comments friendly and respectful. So I know Danny Johnson is the policy lead on this initiative. He does want to provide an update before we turn it over to John. So Danny, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Christina. So this initiative was originally scheduled to go to the EIM governing body in May. However, after we received comments on the draft final proposal, we thought that it would be appropriate to slow down a little bit and clarify some of the concerns that were raised and questions that were raised in a final proposal, and we'll be moving to take this to the June EIM governing body instead of May. I think that there will also be some schedule adjustments on the tariff development process to make sure that syncs up with the final policy and any changes that are made there. But I just wanted to provide everybody with that update.
Great, thank you, Danny. So we did, like I said, we did receive some comments, which we are planning to address. We have a matrix. It may be small on your side, so there is a navigation bar to the left of the screen, and you can use a magnifying glass to either zoom in or out of the document, depending on your preference. So just wanted to let you know. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to John.
Thanks, Christina. My name is John Anders. In the legal department, and I'll be walking through this matrix, which attempts to sort of organize all of the comments that we received by tariff section, and then a tentative CAISO response. And I'll just walk through that. We'll take questions along the way. I just want to say thanks. We really appreciate all the detailed comments and the review. This was a lot of material to review in a relatively short period of time. So we really appreciate that. And again, this draft and the comments are all kind of premised on where we are now, which is the draft final proposal. So there are some areas that will probably need to be updated following publication of the final proposal. I'll go over those, but the other comment I'd like to make before we get going is in terms of the EIM, as I've said before, adding a new role, so the sub-entity role, it raises sort of some kind of structural or definitional questions within the context of the EIM tariff in Section 29 and other areas of the tariff, and you'll begin to see as we go through the comments, some of these relations were, are not simple matters to resolve, and they were addressed earlier. So we will be probably deferring a response or not addressing some of the comments in this tariff amendment, and I'll try to explain as best I can along the way why. But I just wanted to let you know that that does come up from time to time in in this review, because people did take time and look thoroughly through everything, so we do appreciate that. All right, so with that general introduction, we'll just go ahead and kind of walk all the way through this and then be done with it. The idea here would be that we'll get through this. We will not post this until we publish the next round of tariff. So when we publish the next round of tariff based on the final proposal, we'll kind of reply to all the comments, and then maybe we'll add some explanation about the changes to the tariff in maybe a matrix form like this, so that everybody has kind of everything to reply in a final round of comments. That's what we're thinking, and we'll talk about the timeline for that when we get towards the end of this call. All right, so let's just go through this. Might be a little painful, but we'll get there. So the first comment was just kind of update the table of contents, and we certainly will do that, and we'll adjust any formatting. And we have things like reconciliation of effective dates of different provisions and all that. The tariff, as it stands, was based on the most recently accepted version of the tariff, with some other pending matters still to be incorporated. So we'll have to take care of all of that, including the table of contents, when it comes time to file. So we won't bother ourselves with that at this time. Then moving on in section 29.1. This is a discussion of the temporary suspension provisions, and there was a comment to cross-reference from this section over to the termination section in 29.4, and the section 29.4 references back to this suspension section, so we think that that's sufficient, and we don't think it's necessary to reference from here over to there. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I'm just going to kind of keep going through all of this so we can kind of get through it. Just please raise your hand and interrupt me, rather than me like pausing and saying, are there any questions about each little row that we go through? We can just kind of go through them all, and you can stop me and we'll go back or whatever it takes. So that's our explanation of that requested change there. The next one is an area. It comes up in this section 29.A2, and it is a question about the submission of what's called EIM transmission information, and so this is covered in section 29.17 of the tariff more specifically, and has defined terms and whatnot. And the network model submissions and transmission outages and those kind of things are kind of within the scope of transmission information. So there's several areas where Platte River is asking if we're going to update those provisions in section 29.17 to account for the provision of transmission information by sub-entities. Right now we have accounted for outages and network model information in section 29. I think it's 4. And so for now that's where we are. But what we'll do is once we have a clear picture of all the information, outages, transmission information, and anything else, or more clarity around this kind of information submissions, will update the tariff consistent with the final proposal, and make any adjustments throughout as we think is appropriate, and seek your comments on that at that time. But we haven't done that in this round of comments just because of the dependency of that final proposal. So, Christina, if you want to go to the next page. Thank you. So the next comment was a definitional one. It looks like we used the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission instead of FERC, and so it looks like FERC is the most commonly used term in the tariff, and so we'll correct that. That seems pretty ministerial. Then the The next comment is again in section 29.2. The FERC appears again, so we will make that correction. You can go to the next page, Christina. All right. Now this one is a request for a clarification that it's kind of circular. I would suggest is the way to explain it, to refer to the full network model submission by the EIM entity that's then integrated into the full network model. Well, it really doesn't become the full network model until it's integrated. So I think we'll make this clarification to just say that it's the network model data of the prospective entity that's integrated, and then it becomes the full network model. So that's that. Later on, there's a comment about updating the definition of full network model, and we'll get to that in a minute here. The next comment, still in 29.2, it looks like there was, and this is the section that defines the qualifications of a sub-entity, so it's an important section. They've requested that we use the defined tariff terms of wholesale customer and local publicly owned electric utility. So we took a look at that, and the defined term wholesale customer in the CAISO tariff definition is unique to the CAISO balancing authority area. So we don't think it would be appropriate to just use the defined term wholesale customer as defined. We think it's a fairly well understood industry term in this context in particular, and we don't have an issue with leaving it as an undefined term. And just so everyone knows, when we do define an EIM specific term, we use the modifier EIM in front of every term to the extent it was sort of unique to the EIM. So we would, either that or we'd have to amend the tariff definition for wholesale customer to account for non-CAISO BAA customers, and then that triggers a whole series of issues in the rest of the tariff. So we think the answer here is just to leave it uncapitalized. On the other hand, local publicly owned electric utility is defined generically in the CAISO tariff, so we could go ahead and capitalize that term and use the Appendix A defined term for that reference. All right, moving on. Looks like this one spills over to the next page, but that we're going to be okay with this additional clarification in this section 29.2C2. And then the next comment, not sure why the redlining disappeared, but in any event, I think the request was to essentially require the ISO to consult with the prospective sub-entity and associated EIM entity with regard to the timing of the implementation. And in terms of the EIM entity implementations, all throughout, since the beginning, it's been in the sole discretion of the ISO, and we've obviously worked with customers to come up with a workable date that works for everyone. So we're going to parallel the same language here as we do for the EIM entity and not include the additional obligation to consult with the sub-entity and associated EIM entity. So that's the proposal there. Obviously, there's lots of safeguards against issues, but we need to maintain that final discretion to determine the date. The next section, 29.2C6, here, again, there's a suggestion to add a provision in the event of a delay, I guess, or something, sort of a tariff level obligation of good faith to work together and resolve issues. In our view, this is kind of something that's covered, through project management, and definitely if there was something significant or serious that couldn't be resolved, there's dispute resolution provisions that would apply. So we don't think it's necessary to include another sort of good faith obligation to resolve issues. It just could create some confusion, and we don't think that that's necessary, given the other provisions that would apply under those kinds of circumstances. All right, so now we have another one spilling over. Here again, yeah.
This is Christina. I'm going to actually share the document. I have it pulled up in WebEx right now. I think it's going to be a little easier to kind of scroll so people can see both pages. So just hold on one second. Why don't we just go ahead and pause and see if anybody has any questions also. Again, press #2 to raise your hand.
This is Ethan, the event producer for today. So far, I'm not seeing any hands in the queue. But once again, you can enter the queue by pressing #2.
Great, okay. And you can see the document, correct?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
And if you'd like to zoom in a little bit, just to make it a little bit easier to see, that would be perfect.
What's that, Ethan? I'm sorry.
If you would like to zoom in just a little bit on the presentation on your end, that way we could see it a little bit better.
Hold on a second. I will do that. Yeah, there we go. Sorry to interrupt you, John. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. That makes sense. I think several of these are going to spill over like that. All right. So again, here this is that CAISO balancing authority area specific. We have to reconcile these defined terms, and in the case of interchange schedule, that's a CAISO balancing area specific definition, and the term interchange is defined generically. So in the original construction, we lowercase schedules again because it's well understood in this context, and not to confuse the term with the CAISO BA definition, or to create even more, unique or different definitions, or having to reconcile the definition. We just left it lowercase. So we'll do that. We'll keep it lowercase and not accept this proposed change. The next section in 29.4F, there's a request to remove some confusing terms by their terms, and we'll accept that proposed change. Again, in section 29.4F, there's a request to change the word ensure to verify, and we'll accept that proposed change as well. And then we're still in 29.4F. There's a change to change the reference to say, or add the words in which it is located, and we'll accept that proposed change. So now we're scrolling on over to page 6. Here we have a kind of a from utilizing to using, and then to add the words as applicable, and we'll accept those proposed changes in section 29.4. All right, the next group of changes are all from Pacific Core, and so these pertain more specifically to the policy discussion of manual dispatches. And so what Pacific Core had asked for and repeats here in the tariff was that, they prefer not to allow the subentity to manually dispatch resources, but they're asking if they are allowed to do so, that would require authorization by the EIM entity. So that's one of the pieces of the proposal and comments that's under review and consideration, and will be addressed in the final proposal. So we will resolve this section in Pacific Core's comments in the tariff after the policy the final proposal is published. All right, so that takes us all the way down to the next page, Christina, 7 to 8. Yeah, there you go. Keep going. Yeah, a little farther. This is 6 cities comment is the next one, and yep, that one, and we'll accept that. So I'd like to. It looks like we had referenced financial impact as the something that would need to be resolved between the entity and the sub-entity in response to a manual dispatch instruction, and 6 cities is asking that we add operational impacts, and I think that is appropriate. So we'll make that addition to the tariff. So it's financial and operational impacts resulting from the manual dispatches, any potential issues there. Then we have this one from Platte River, goes on both pages. Let's see. Okay, so this is where asking for some modification, arguably clarification, but I haven't thought it completely the way through, and there are some arguably substantive changes as a result of the request. So we're going to defer this. This is not really within the scope of this proposal. The sections of in other words, the sections of the EIM tariff that address what an EIM entity does in response to what kind of scheduled flow mitigation procedure. It might be possible to revisit this at some point. I know that this has becoming a much greater topic of interest as the EIM grows and expands into other regions, particularly the Rocky Mountains, where there's a lot of braided paths and all happening, and so we'll take this under consideration at a future time, and if there's any more changes, we'll consider them later. The next one is the ISO will accept. They're asking for some clarifying language in section 29.9B. Similarly, the section 29.9B2, there's a request to add the word to, and we will accept that change. Doing great, Christina, scrolling along with me here in real time. The next one, again, the same clarification of the delegation. We'll accept that change. Add a period at the end of Section D2, certainly we'll do that. And then 29.9E, as we spill over, Platte River is asking for just kind of a reordering or characterization of the references to the EIM entity BAA and the sub-entity area. And so I think those changes look good to us, and so we'll accept those changes as well. Again, 29.9E, 6 cities had a similar comment, and we'll reconcile these two comments from 6 cities and Platte River in the final version and clarify these references accordingly.
So you said, do we have anybody yet? I just want to make sure that we don't have anybody waiting.
No, we do not have anyone in the queue at this time.
Okay.
All right. All right, so now we're over on the top of page 12. And this again, okay, here we go. We're circling back. These comments relate to the submission of outages and the procedures for that and who notifies who. And so we're going to defer addressing this comment until we get the final proposal and can make sure we, have the right approach to outages and full network model submissions and manual dispatches and all the rest of the important pieces of the sub-entity, operations. Okay, now we're moving into the settlements section, and 29.11. So here, there's two comments in one, and then the first comment is whether the CAISO would aggregate the base schedules of supply, or the EIM entity would aggregate the base schedules, and whether that would have any impact on the language in this section for the over and under scheduling penalties. My understanding is that the CAISO will aggregate the base schedules for supply to determine whether or not there's been any over and under scheduling, and then allocate any penalties that were assessed to the load based on the formulation of this provision. So to us, the aggregation and then the allocation or sub-allocation to the sub-entities of these charges follows because we're allocating it to load. So it's kind of, I don't know, from my view, it happens, automatically or by design of the original provision without any further changes required for the sub-entity. But if there's further discussion around this, we'll call on James as a subject matter expert to help us with that. And I think this has been the subject of discussion in the stakeholder process. And I think we did walk through some examples about this. So if there's still confusion, we can follow up, but we don't think any changes are needed. But we will make the clarifying edits. And 6 cities also requested a similar change to add the word with after the word settle, and we will accept that proposed change so that it's clear. But that's the only change we would be making to that section. Okay. And here, 6 cities probably queuing off the use of startup costs in other contexts suggests we just refer to costs incurred to implement, and I think those are good changes. So we'll accept those changes in this provision here. Continuing on, 6 cities is asked for a clarifying change, and we'll accept that in this. It's to basically ask that it's a deadline for CAISO action will be told, not everybody's action. So that's a good requested change, because it is the CAISO action in the failure of a payment on an invoice to the CAISO. Okay. 29.11i. So this is the reference to the administrative charge. So there's no substantive changes to the administrative charge. I think that was all explained in the policy development. And here, asking to reference the tariff-defined term market services charge. So the market services charge is an actual charge, and it's a charge component of the grid management charge, and it's all in Appendix F. And when we originally drafted this, we kind of wanted to separate the EIM administrative charge and make it clear it was not part of the grid management charge. It's true that we're using components that are also used in the market services charge, but we didn't want to confuse things and cross-reference a CAISO grid management, which is really a day-ahead market, a full participation charge type calculation here in the context of the EIM. So we will not accept this proposed change. We think it's sufficiently clear as it was written. All right, the next one, I think we're going to accept this change. It was in 29.11i5 to remove sub-entity from the title. And then I think there's a related question from the 6 cities, and we'll look at these together when we get to the updated tariff. But the 6 cities was concerned that it wasn't, wasn't clear that if an EIM entity terminates participation, that the sub-entities within the BAA also terminate. So we'll clarify that. That's certainly the expected result, and you can't have a sub-entity without an entity. So we'll make that clear in the tariff. And now we're moving on to 16.
John, hold on one second. We do have a hand raised in the queue.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and take the question before we move too far along.
All righty. Caller, you have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Tony Delacruz with Utilicast. I'm working with Piesco. 2 items. Number 1, several pages back, the question is who aggregates base schedules for the sub-entities? And you said CAISA does that? That's inconsistent with what we were told before, that they will not aggregate base schedules. They will assume, CAISA will assume the load forecast was scheduled. Can you please comment on that?
Sure. I'll ask James to come in here, and maybe I got that.
All right.
Go ahead.
This is James Lynn, ISO. So what's going to happen is the base scheduling and scheduling coordinator, the sub-entity participating scheduling coordinator, or the EIM scheduling coordinator will be submitting base schedules to the ISO. The ISO will, when we're doing the assessment as to whether or not you have passed the sufficiency test for balancing, we have to aggregate those base schedules up into a net supply variable, which we then compare against the demand forecast and determine whether or not you have passed the balancing test. At that point, when we get to settlements, we're going to do a similar thing. We're going to take your overall information and make a determination whether or not you overscheduled versus underscheduled based upon the information for meter and comparison to your base schedules. Now, with the calculation of the hourly load-based schedule, the similar thing is going to occur is the system is going to take all of the submitted base schedules, aggregate it into a net total, and then based upon the forecast, they're going to distribute what's called the EIM area base, or hourly load base schedule, will then be distributed down to the CLAPs using the forecast information. So that will go along with that presentation I gave a couple days ago. Does that help answer your question?
Yes. So you will do that at the EIM entity level and not at the sub-entity level when it comes to the evaluation of over or under schedule.
Correct. We will make the determination if you've passed the balancing test, efficiency tests at the balancing authority area level. Then we will make the determination if you are outside of the thresholds for the overscheduling and underscheduling at the balancing authority area level. However, if you go outside those thresholds when it comes to applying the prices or actually the penalty, we will then bring that granularity down to the individual CLAP level, because the penalty is actually an adjustment upon the load settlement. And so we are going to use each of the load areas determination and their CLAP pricing to determine what the overall pricing is for that EIM balancing authority area.
Okay. James, where can I find that presentation you made?
Let me get that to you. I know I did a presentation with Piesco on how we're going to do the forecast and the load, but we also did a presentation in the actual draft final proposal, or the last proposal, on how the overscheduling and underscheduling is going to work.
If it's posted, I can get it.
It should be a presentation. Yeah, it should be there. If not, we can maybe in the Fiesco track 5, we can walk through that again too.
Okay. The other question I've got, you go back up to the beginning of settlements section. There is a reference that under instructed imbalance energy, FMM and RTD, it states that you added the terms EIM sub-entity scheduling coordinator under the participating resource section in both of them. I wasn't aware that an EIM sub-entity scheduling coordinator could have participating resources. Can you elaborate?
So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if we have a specific comment on that, but the EIM sub-entity may have participating resources, but you're correct that those would be under a participating resource scheduling coordinator ID, not under the sub-entity, which would have the non-participating resources and loads.
So the sub-entity has to identify if there's participating resources in their area that would be accounted toward them. But yeah, so that would be 2911 B1AI and 2911 B1 or B2I has sub-entity scheduling coordinator in here. I saw that this morning. I was somewhat confused. So thank you.
Okay, so that's the general imbalance energy charge calculations. Is that right?
Yeah, one is FMM instructed, the other one is E instructed.
So I wanted to do some clarification on that too. Is an EIM sub-entity scheduling coordinator's resources can potentially or can have some FMM instructed imbalance energy and RTD instructed imbalance energy if you have a manual dispatch, because manual dispatches are automatically classified as instructed imbalance energy. You have energy that was dispatched for regulation by your operators. And then another area would be if you have a non-participating variable energy resource that is following its forecast, and so that we will dispatch it in accordance to its forecast. So you can have some situations where your non-participating resource will get some instructed imbalance energy. It's not due to bids. It's due to either operator intervention or following a forecast.
Thank you, James. That was very helpful.
Great. I think we have one more hand raised. Is that correct, Ethan?
Yes, I'll go ahead and put them through now.
Okay, thank you.
Caller, you have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Caleb Brimhall, Platte River Power Authority, and I just had a question regarding 2911D1A, and it talks about, so I think everybody's in agreement that CalISO is going to aggregate the base schedules. If you go back to that section, the question that I would have is if those schedules are going to be aggregated. Currently, the tariff says the EIM base schedule of supply. So it says that it's going to look at the EIM base schedule of supply submitted by the EIM entity. And if CalISO is aggregating those, I think we need to add submitted by the EIM entity and EIM sub-entity. Because if I'm understanding that correctly, CalISO is going to aggregate them, and both entities would be submitting those base schedules. And it's 29.11D1A.
Oh, D1A. Thank you.
Yeah, Christine, I think it's those two sections, D, that we have broken out that level. Yeah. Go ahead, James.
Okay.
Now, I'm just wondering, and I wanted to read that section, because we may have to go back and review it. Does it say final base schedules?
It does not say final base schedule. So
yeah, because I think the intent. Go ahead, real quick.
No, you can go ahead. And it's not something, it's just something really to flag, to look at, to make sure we just understand the process. Because my understanding is if we're aggregating, you've got to have, right, you've got to have our schedule as well, the sub-entity schedule as well, in order to do an aggregation and actually make the full. Because we understand it's having at the BAA level, but because we're submitting our own base schedules, you're going to have to add those in order to actually be able to do the balancing test. Unless I may be missing something there. So.
You're not, but it's, so we're going to run several balancing tests. You got the T70, T55, T40, and then when the base schedule initiative goes in, you'll have another one at T30. Now, from T55 to the T30, the EIM entity is responsible for submitting any updated or final base schedules. And that's what the final balancing test is referencing, is those final schedules. Now, if the EIM entity does not update any of the base schedules already submitted, that in essence is considered the EIM approving that base schedule for the balancing test. And I think that's why we wrote it that way, is because the final authority on the balancing base schedules being submitted is the EIM entity. Even though it may default back to your original base schedule, they have final authority on those.
Okay, that is very helpful. Thank you, and that makes sense. So essentially, whatever's submitted, really the test is going to go off the final approved EIM entity, whatever they finally approved, and so that's why it's being left as that, because the EIM entity will essentially approve or disapprove essentially what's going to be used in the test.
Yeah, they'll either approve it or update it.
Perfect.
So
Thank you. That's helpful.
That's defaulted. Yeah, if they don't update, we default that to approval.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, Ethan?
It appears we do have another hand raised in the queue. I'll go ahead and put that through now. Caller, you've been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Tony Delacruz again from Utilicast, working with Piesco. In that over-under scheduling section, James, first of all, it doesn't say final base schedule. I don't know if that's that needed. But when you read this, if you have a violation, please comment on, it looks like, let's say that you have 4 entities within a BA and they're overscheduled, but one of the entities is underscheduled. It appears, based upon the language, they'll still be charged the imbalance penalty. Is that correct? Was that the intent?
Well, so the intent, and that's why I'd like to go through that at some point. I'll walk again with Piesco through the presentation. The intent is to get to what the final penalty would be at the balancing authority area level. So what you will have is, let's say the balancing authority area is overscheduled. It exceeds the 5%. We will apply the CLAP pricing associated with the overscheduling threshold 1 to all of the undistracted imbalance energy. What will end up happening is for that one participant who is underscheduled, they will end up getting a payment that is going to offset those that were overscheduled, so then we can get to, we aggregate that up, I have my balancing authority areas overscheduling penalty.
Okay.
So some nuances in there.
That clears it up a little bit. Thank you. By the way, I did not see that presentation posted, so.
Okay.
Ethan, do we have any other questions?
There are no further hands raised in the queue at this time.
Okay, John, I think we're on page 16, correct?
That's right, yeah. Okay. Okay, I think we are, let's just go with 29.11s since the last one will accept a misspelling of the word energy. So this section 29.11s, it looks like they're asking to sort of change the entitlement of the entity to have access to the information to that the CAISO shall provide. We think that it's appropriate just to identify the right of the entity to have the access to the information, and then we can specify in the BPM the method or the means by which they would be provided the access. It's a little bit of semantics. It's not that big of a deal, but we're going to stick with the current construction and provide some additional details in the BPM about that. All right, now we're shifting gears into 29.17a, and this again goes back to the transmission information and the provision of that information, and so we will reconcile these comments in the final proposal in the next round of the tariff. Same with section 29.26b. Then this is a little bit more expansive. It talks about who's actually the transmission service provider. So in this section of the EIM tariff, it defers to the EIM entity as the transmission service provider for allocating and accounting for the costs. And the question is, if the sub-entity is making transmission available, then are they the transmission service provider? And so we'll work this through in the final proposal. Just my initial reaction is as far as the EIM goes, we weren't contemplating that sub-entities would be the directly making their transmission available to the EIM. They're either a sub-entity or non-sub-entity, but the transmission by virtue of the entity joining is available internally, transmission that is. So enough about that, but we can talk about that and we'll explain all that in the final proposal. Moving on. The 6 cities in 29.34, so now we're into the sort of the operations sections. It was requested that we clarify that it's for the EIM entities, so we'll accept that proposed change. Another change by the 6 cities, again, to add the word operational. If there's any issues, it's not just financial impacts, it's financial and operational, so we'll accept that change. And then 29.34G looks like asking for a clarifying edit. We will clarify it slightly differently by adding the words within the EIM entity BAA rather than adding reference to the sub-entity area again. Just a drafting approach, not a big deal. Here, there was a we're going to double check this one, but the request was to, instead of referring to the load forecast, we refer to the demand forecast. We do think that the demand forecast is the right cross-reference, but we haven't had a full opportunity to double check that, and we'll give it another look. This is in the, I think it's in the available balancing capacity section, which was added at a later time, so it's possible that it got referenced as load forecast when it should have been demand forecast. So we'll double check that, but we don't see an issue correcting that. It is a appropriately defined term. Now we're moving into the code of conduct in 29.37. So here there's an exclusion of the code of conduct for section 37.2, which is essentially the section that talks about following ISO dispatch instructions and that sort of a thing, and the consequences for that. That's excluded, but everything else currently applies. And Platte River is saying, well, there's 2 other sections, subsections, I should say, that shouldn't apply. The first one is about if you bid in a resource, that it should be reasonably available to meet the obligation of the economic bid, and we think that should continue to apply, and that was 37311. So that's the way that works. And then as far as the submission of the outages, we think that should also apply, even though the ISO is not technically approving the outages. As I understand it, in the outage management systems, we are technically accepting the outages as approved. So we're not formally reviewing and approving them, but once they go through the system, they're as if they were approved. So we don't want to make any changes to this section here. We think it's appropriate. It's been that way for a while now, but if there's any questions about this, since we're kind of roaming outside of the proposal a bit, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I think we do have one hand raised. Is that correct, Ethan?
Yes, we do have one hand raised in the queue at this time. I'll go ahead and put them through now.
Thank you.
Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, John, this is Caleb Ramal, Platte River Power Authority. And so Platte River doesn't see it as outside the scope of this proposal. So the language, we concur with you that they should be submitted, right? When we're going to submit a bid, it should be, and an outage, it should follow the guidelines. That's not the concern here. The concern is that the language in 37.3.1.1, so we'll start with 37.3.1.1, it makes it appear that an EIM entity must bid in all its resources. So that's our concern there. There's somewhat of a discrepancy where it almost looks like that's a requirement, and under the EIM, of course, that's not a requirement. You don't have to bid in those resources. If we do, we absolutely agree with the conditions of bidding it in, but we're concerned that there's a conflict between the optionality within the EIM versus the day-ahead market. And so that's the concern. So absolutely agree that those conditions are valid, and we're not going to submit anything that doesn't follow the conditions. But the concern is about the mandatory versus optional between the EIM versus the day-ahead. Does that make sense?
Okay. It does, and I'll double check, but I think there's language in the introductory provisions that talk about when other sections of the tariff are incorporated. If there's a conflict, I think that the tariff in that Section 29, will govern. But we can double check that. I hear what you're suggesting, and I would fully expect that whatever you don't have an obligation to bid in the resource, it would continue to apply in the EIM context. There's no must offer. Yeah.
So yeah, and that was just what we wanted to flag there, and so if we can touch base on that and just make sure, because we couldn't find it. We couldn't find where there was essentially that exclusion anywhere, and so that's why we flagged it. Similarly, on the 37.4.2.1, again, the concern is that right under the EIM, CalISO is not approving the outage, and we read the language as essentially having CalISO grant approval for the outage. We're submitting them so that CalISO is aware of those, but again, the difference between the EIM versus the day ahead, CalISO isn't approving those outages, and so it's a similar concern there that essentially we haven't found a place where that exclusion is clear, where it's making the distinction, agree that, of course, outages and bids need to be correctly submitted, but want to clarify that outages are not approved by CalISO for the EIM entities, or the EIM entity / sub-entity. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah. Well? Similar comment. I'll double check Section 29.9. I hope it is clear enough that the CAISO is not approving the outages, and then that provision about precedent of 29 over the rest of the tariff would come into play. But we can talk further about this. We are kind of hesitant, in some ways, just because, the EIM has been up and running for some time, and there's been kind of an understanding. I mean, we're not resistant to improvements and clarifications and all that, but, we weren't really talking about this, but we were talking about the submission of outages, so that's a fair comment, but we're careful. How's that? I'll just leave it at that.
No, and appreciate that and appreciate you considering it, and if you're good with it, would love to just follow up with you offline to make sure we understand, and we may just have been missing something where you can point it out and say, yeah, it is, here's where the clarifying language is. So we appreciate your willingness to take a look and appreciate your help.
Yeah, no, thanks, Caleb. Yeah, we'll take a look. I have a little bit more homework to do on this one now that I understand it better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
There are no further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay.
Okay. So the next one is a definition issue. It looks like in drafting the EIM tariff, we made a presumption that was inaccurate, that the term flexible ramping product, it's not defined. It's used in the heading of the section 44 of the tariff, but it's not actually defined in the tariff. So we'll probably just lowercase that to be clear, because we do reference section 29.44, but if we need additional references or clarifications, we'll do that. But another way to do it would be to define flexible ramping product by reference to section 44, but that's amending the CAISO tariff. So it's one of those tricky areas, but we'll work on that and get it right. So thank you. All right, moving on, the request for updates to the transmission service information and transmission service provider definition. We're going to defer that for now, as I mentioned earlier. And then let's keep going. Oh, did I skip over self-schedules? Yeah, I did skip over self-schedules. Self-schedule is a defined term in the CAISO tariff, so we'll leave that one as is. Yeah, you're doing good, Christina. You can go to page 21 now. Yep. Here again is the flexible ramping product comment. And okay, this one here on the full network model, again, we prefer not to make any changes certainly not to the definition of full network model. It's utilized throughout the CAISO tariff and BPMs, and it's worked in the context of the BPM. The EIM to date. It would be difficult to amend it to make it sort of as generic as proposed. We'll take another look at this, but our preference would be to not update a definition of the CAISO tariff, the full network model definition. But we'll take another look at this. Again, here's the self-schedule reference. So we've referenced the definition that was in Appendix A. So self-schedule and the plural self-schedules should be adequately defined already. All right. Now we're on to 22. I think that the 6 cities is asking that we add applicable requirements of the CAISO tariff to help clarify the definition of EIM entity scheduling coordinator. And here, this is sort of the framework of the Section 29 in the EIM. So the Section 29 should be sufficient reference in terms of the tariff. So the agreements reference Section 29 in the tariff. Section 29 of the tariff references other sections of the tariff as they apply to EIM participants. So it's it works in context of the EIM entities, and we just paralleled the language here, so we're not going to amend the language with regard to sub-entities or EIM entities as requested by the 6 cities. The next one is just a typo in the agreement cover page. We'll correct that. And then we have, we're into the EIM sub-entity implementation agreement, and 6 cities is asking that we clarify the recitals that it's a part of implementation, and I think that that's an appropriate change. We'll go ahead and make that. Again, in the sub-entity agreement, the 6 cities is asking for a couple of clarifying changes. The first one is, again, the same response with regard to Section 29 and how it was incorporated into these agreements, and it should be sufficient and for purposes of applying the appropriate tariff provisions to the prospective EIM sub-entities. And then as far as the latter change, I think that this goes back to the 6 cities' earlier comment about clarifying that when an entity terminates, that the sub-entity would also terminate. So we'll make that clarifying change. Okay, we're on 24. 6 cities is asking for a clarification around to make it clear that it's the payment of invoices and it's the totaling of for CAISO actions that are what matters in this context, and that we also clarify that it's for payments in excess of the costs incurred by the CAISO. So all of those edits, and I apologize if somehow lost the redlining, I think, in the translation here somewhere, but they're highlighted in yellow there, and we'll accept those changes. Again, 6 cities at the bottom of page 25 and on to the next is asking for a little bit of more clarity, and I think that that's a good change to reference the agreements between the balancing area in which it's located. All right, now we're into the EIM Entity Scheduling Coordinator Agreement, 6 cities, and again, a typo, we'll correct that. And the 6 cities was caught a duplication of a term, latter of, and we'll remove that, correct that duplication. Moving on again, title page correction, typo, we'll fix that. EIM Entity Sub-Entity Agreement, Section 2.5, this is Platte River. Again, this is, again, talking about the submission of transmission service information and the making available the transmission system for use by the EIM. So in the EIM Entity Agreement, which these were modeled on, there's a provision about making the internal transmission available for use by the EIM, and we'll clarify this in response to the final proposal with regard to the role and function of the sub-entity as far as providing transmission information and making transmission available on its systems for use by the EIM. Then, let's see. Oh, okay. I was noting on page 27 that we would retain the deletion of Section 2.6 in any event. I think both Section 2.5 and 2.6 were removed, and Platte River's question is more about Section 2.5, but 2.6 will remain deleted. All right, is this the last one? Well, no, almost. The 6 cities, again, it's the same comment as above, so we will accept the clarifying reference, but we will not change or expand the cross-reference to Section 29 of the tariff. Let's see. Last one on page 28. necessary approvals, many for the balance. I think we'll accept that change. Yeah, it's clarifying that it's a sub-entity and that they need to have appropriate arrangements in place between them and the balancing authority area. So we think that that's appropriate as well. All right, well, that concludes our review of the stakeholder comments. Apologies for any, deferrals or confusion. Tried to get as much out as we could. It was kind of a short turnaround here for us to get that for this meeting. And I think we're in good shape, and we really appreciate everybody's comments. And we will look forward to further comments on the final proposal and then the updated tariff language to implement the final proposal. And we'll just keep going along from here. And I think we have room between now and the June governing body meeting to, be in a pretty good shape by the time we get there in terms of the tariff. And then following that, we will be looking to file in June. And again, we're looking for a requested effective date of September 1 in order to support the PSCO and JDA parties and other interested sub-entities in the Colorado Balancing Authority area.
Okay, so let's see if anybody has any questions on anything that we covered today, and we'll just kind of go over the next step, just as a reminder in case you missed the beginning of the meeting. Ethan, do we have anybody in the queue? Again, press #2 to raise your hand.
We do have a few in the question queue at this time. I'll go ahead with the first caller. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair, representing the 6 cities. I have a request to make regarding the revisions to the final proposal and also the various implementation documents, the draft tariff language and the draft pro forma agreements. It's an awful lot of volume to review. And it would be really helpful if you could find some way of identifying new changes, in other words, to the draft tariff language, put it in a different font color or highlight it somehow so that we don't have to kind of closely review everything from scratch.
Yeah, Bonnie, this is John. So when the next version of the tariff comes out, maybe I could use 2 colors and shade the incremental edits in response to current comments in, whatever green, and then the edits that were updated in response to that are new kind of in terms of responding to the final proposal in a different color blue or something like that. And then that would give you a complete set of changes and then differentiate them between the 2, the responsive to stakeholder comments from the first round or to update the tariff consistent with the final proposal. Does that work?
Yeah, that would be great. And also, to the extent that it's possible to kind of redline or highlight the final proposal itself so that you can do a quick you can make a quick view of what's changing in terms of the policy provisions.
Yeah, Bonnie, this is Danny. We were planning on doing that, so
that'd be great.
We will make sure to differentiate the changes.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, John. Hi, Christina. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. And first, great job in walking through this document. But I guess my comments are just kind of in line with Bonnie's, that to help with kind of tracking through all this the next month goes on, it would be really helpful just to publish this document, even if it's watermarked in deep red that it's a draft document and will be updated. It just would be a lot easier to be able to have captured all 28 pages and be able to reference back to it as we're prepping for the next document that's coming out. So just a plea for that and appreciation for the presentation today.
So Dan, you're asking for it to be published before, not concurrent with the next version of the tariff? Even though it might change.
If you could just make the one that you ran through today available, even knowing that it's draft and is definitely going to change, I think it'd be helpful.
Yeah, I'll think about that a little bit, but I don't see any off the top of my head issues with watermarking it or something and posting it. And again, we've had a limited amount of time to try to process all this, and it's kind of a work in progress. So we'd appreciate understanding on all that if we do publish it.
For sure, and I thought you did a great job of filling out the responses on it. So seemed good. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Any other questions, Ethan?
Yes, we do have one more in the queue at this time.
Okay.
While you are unmuted, please go ahead. Caller, please ensure that your device is unmuted as well.
Thank you. I was still muted. This is Caleb Brimhall, Flat River Power Authority. And thanks, I would echo thanks for all of your work in going through this and appreciate all the efforts that CalISO is doing. And this may be followed up in the next steps, so I probably should have waited till after you told the next steps, but I just wanted to ask if we did have any rough timing for the next proposal and then the tariff revisions so we can plan. So I was just curious if any of those dates or the schedule had been established. And then just wanted to clarify, so tomorrow at the EIM governing body meeting, there will be no action taken on the EIM sub-entity initiative. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Perfect. So, yeah, if there's any additional schedule updates, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, Caleb, this is Danny. I would look for a final proposal to be put out sometime during the week of the 17th.
And so at that time, we'll, like John said, we'll publish a revised draft tariff language. So the time, those two items.
Right. What we'll do, Christina, is it probably won't be concurrent, so we'll probably publish a revised schedule for the draft tariff in the final proposal, and whatever the time frame we've said we publish the update from there. So it'll be sometime later in May that the final proposal is out.
Great. Yeah, and we will have the revised tariff. We'll have another bite at the apple. That's really all I had. We will issue a notice once the final proposal is posted and provide, a deadline for when we want comments back. But we will communicate any future activities in a notice. So that's really all we have today. Anybody from the ISO team have any final comments or any final questions from stakeholders? Again, press pound 2.
At this time, I'm not appearing to see any hands be raised in the queue at this time.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you submitting comments and also, just the questions today to help clarify. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Ethan, for your help. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Well, that concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.